An explosive trove of text messages has given fresh insight into Matt Hancock's early handling of the pandemic.
Matt Hancock, the then health minister, talked openly with his colleagues about, quote unquote, scaring the pants off everyone.
Matt Hancock says that he's the victim of a massive betrayal and breach of trust.
The journalist, Isabel Oakeshott, who revealed the messages, says she's acted in the public interest.
Now, if you've never heard of Matt Hancock, you're in for a real treat. Britain's former health secretary during the pandemic is being humiliated by a newspaper which is slowly and painfully publishing his WhatsApp messages. They reveal that he wanted to scare the pants off everyone with the new strain of the coronavirus. He also discussed when to deploy the new variant. We only know this thanks to a journalist called Isabel Oakeshott, who he trusted with 100,000 of his WhatsApp messages. It's a very British scandal and a mixture of the very serious and the very silly. Matt Hancock used to be someone in British politics. The health secretary during the pandemic, he had a really important position, working closely with the Prime Minister and the country's top scientists.
Good evening. The NHS is under significant pressure in all parts of the country.
His 3 years as health secretary weren't all dignified press conferences, though. In fact, they were filled with scandal and accusations. Some of the darker points on his record include his failure to protect people in care homes. Some 20,000 residents died in the first 3 months of the pandemic.
Care, the mistakes that were made there for those vulnerable people. There are times when you've blamed the care workers for bringing it in, and that's been put on record by you. So do you now regret that?
No.
No,
just to be totally clear, I do not blame the care workers at all.
He also failed to procure PPE in a fair and transparent way to many, and is accused of giving his friends lucrative contracts.
What an absolute load of rubbish. Did anybody else's friends get a contract? Mine didn't. None of my friends are on those lists.
And then the final straw, he was caught on CCTV with his lover, vigorously breaking his own social distancing rules. He had to go.
Those of us who make these rules have got to stick by them, and that's why I've got to resign.
There was a time when a minister would resign in disgrace and then keep a low profile for the rest of his days. But Matt Hancock did the opposite. He went on a game show.
But the bronze bongo is out. He's in third place. Hey. Matt Hancock.
He made hundreds of thousands of dollars from that appearance and gave a tiny fraction to charity. He hoped it would rehabilitate him in the eyes of the British public, but it turned out to be another Hancock cock-up.
Going on I'm a Celebrity in a shameless attempt to rehabilitate his public image is more than insensitive, it's insulting.
In another bid to control the narrative, he teamed up with journalist Isabel Oakeshott to write his memoirs, giving her access to over 100,000 WhatsApp messages between him and his cabinet colleagues and scientific advisors. Pandemic Diaries was published in December last year, but has been totally eclipsed by Oakeshott's so-called betrayal.
Isabel Oakeshott, Matt Hancock says what you've done is a massive betrayal. He's right, isn't he?
I'm really happy to address that question. Look, the betrayal was of the entire population in a deeply flawed response to the pandemic. Every single one of us in this country is paying the price for the mistakes made, and it is incumbent on me as a journalist sitting on 2.3 million words that cast an extraordinary light on what was really going on to get that out there.
It's clear the WhatsApp messages are in the public interest, or at least interesting to the public. The Telegraph reports, among other things, that Hancock didn't listen to scientific advice about how to protect care homes, wanted to scare people with the new variant into complying with ever tighter social distancing rules, even against scientific advice. And they reveal that the chief medical officer advised there was no strong reason to bring masks into school, but the government did so just to avoid an argument with Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Hancock says his messages have been doctored by an anti-lockdown newspaper, and we should wait for a formal public inquiry to do its work. But Oakeshott says ain't nobody got time for that.
The issue is that there is no deadline for that public inquiry. I've looked at its terms of reference. They are basically a lifetime's work for a lot of people. My fear is that we won't get answers for many, many years. I would have thought a decade is optimistic.
OK, let's bring in our experts now, and we have Dr. Anthony Hinton, a surgeon who worked in the NHS for around 40 years. Dr. Bharat Pankhania is an infectious disease control expert, and we also have Nexus regular Andre Walker, a Conservative political commentator. Hello, welcome to all of you. Anthony Hinton, if I may start with you, which of these messages did you find most revealing and most egregious?
Well, I think the two most telling ones so far are one from the 29th of February 2020. So we're talking about almost a month before the first lockdown began. And that was the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, who was advising other people on the WhatsApp group that this was a disease of low mortality, 1% or less, so that any vaccine had to be very safe and no studies could be shortcut. But actually, when we look at what's happened with those vaccine studies, many things, basic toxicology, problems with genetic changes, problems with pregnancy, problems with children, have still not been studied and published properly. There was a second one on the 13th of December 2020, which is again very telling. It shows a contempt for the public. And that was from Matt Hancock himself. And he said, we will have to frighten the pants off them with this new variant. And he was talking about the so-called Kent variant. And in his next message, he said, when do we want to deploy this new variant? Now, I'm not suggesting that they were making these variants in a lab, but by deploying it, they mean when to announce it, because, of course, although there was the Kent variant, there were multiple variants all the way along that were never announced because it's a continuum. It's not a sudden change to a brand new variant that day. And they did it to frighten people. And the reason they were frightening people is that on the press conference at the beginning of November, they got all their graphs wrong, showed about 4 times the number of deaths that were actually ever going to occur. And obviously that made people sort of take no notice. So they had to actually frighten people again, is how they saw it. But that is a very bad thing for public health going forward.
Anthony, we spoke to an epidemiologist, quite a prominent one in the United States, and he says he has every sympathy with Matt Hancock and that he had to scare the population into making a behavioural change, otherwise lives would have been lost.
Well, let's look at when they wanted to lock down most recently, and they couldn't get support for it. And they were predicting again thousands of deaths if we didn't lock down. That was before, that was in sort of December of last year. There was no lockdown. There were no huge rise in cases. They went up a little bit. They went down again on their own, as would have happened on every other occasion. The lockdowns were completely unnecessary and have damaged lots of lives.
Bharat Pankhania, do you have any sympathy with Matt Hancock when he says privately on a WhatsApp message, we need to scare the pants off everyone?
Matthew, do you mind if I first and foremost challenge Dr. Hinton? Dr. Hinton's a surgeon. He's not an infectious disease expert. The vaccines were put through normal protocol. They were tried. The data was analyzed independently, verified, and then the very safe and very effective vaccines were deployed. And it is very disingenuous of Dr. Hinton, retired surgeon, not an expert in infectious disease control, to be talking about and speculating that these vaccines were fast rushed and that they had dubious probity about safety. It's very wrong of him to go on like this. Now, coming on to your question about Matt Hancock, the way the pandemic unfolded, we know that the government in the United Kingdom was making it up as they were going. And what the WhatsApp messages show is that what we believed is actually true, which is they were all disjointed, they were working in separate silos, and they were making it up as they went along. They were not using existing National Health Service Public Health England, which he disbanded himself, the universities, the laboratories, the primary care, the local authority public health departments, none of those were fully engaged by the government, and we knew that we were not being engaged and we were being sidelined.
You said that the government and Matt Hancock in particular showed a lot of insensitivity and were rather callous in their response. What makes you say that?
Well, if we read some of the loose language, for example, the one where he says, we frighten the pants off people when we deploy the new variant. What that message exemplifies is you are taking it so callous. Another message that I have read is about an exchange between a civil servant and Matt Hancock about the casual nature of locking people up as they enter the United Kingdom. All that loose language tells you that you are detached and really detached from the reality of the pain and hardship people were facing. Furthermore, persons like myself were involved with local authority and nursing and care homes, and I know how terrible it was to be isolated, to be kept in lockdown in the nursing homes, not being able to see people, and finally to die alone. A lot of people died alone, and it was unnecessary.
Yeah. Andre, I know that this is a particularly sensitive issue for yourself, and perhaps you could explain.
Yeah, absolutely. My mother was diagnosed with lung cancer shortly before the pandemic began, and obviously there was a huge amount of pressure to put her into the respiratory ward with the COVID patients, where she would have died on her own. And what I've always made the point, and certainly what these WhatsApp messages prove, is a remarkable callousness and insensitivity. I think that's absolutely the right way to describe it, from people who knew the lockdown was hugely damaging, knew that it was of limited benefit, given that most people were not going to die from the coronavirus, but actually they inflicted upon people some real misery, including not being able to see your dying mother for the last few months of her life. And of course, then the unbelievable thing is they'd all had parties in their own departments. Matt Hancock himself, kissed a woman and had an extramarital affair, and that was a breach of the rules. The Prime Minister breached the rules. The latest Prime Minister breached the rules as well. And so the reality is, none of them seem to believe that this lockdown, on balance, was the right thing to do. Now, I'm not saying that if you separate people, that won't stop the disease travelling. Of course it will, but they weren't balancing that against the damage to the economy. And the reality is, the totality of these messages show you they didn't believe that this lockdown was particularly useful. They weren't particular believers in the policy in total. They weren't interested in following the policy themselves. And actually, they left families like mine in quite a miserable position, and they bluntly didn't give a
Andre Walker, Bharat Pankhania and Anthony Hinton, thank you so much for your time today. I'm sorry we can't go on further. For many people, these WhatsApp messages are just more proof that governments are trying to control the narrative. I say more proof because late last month, the Energy Department finally joined the FBI in concluding that the virus probably leaked from a laboratory in Wuhan in China. Now, people have been saying that almost from the beginning of the pandemic, but were shut down at the time and called conspiracy theorists.
It's also pushing U.S. intelligence to find evidence for this theory that the virus was accidentally released from a lab in Wuhan. That's his new angle to feed the wingnuts, to treat this virus like it was a conspiracy of some kind.
It should have never happened. This plague should never have happened. It could have been stopped. But people chose not to stop it.
What people? Tomorrow he'll blame the Spanish flu on Antonio Banderas.
I'm glad to say the Nexus never wrote this off as a conspiracy theory and did explore the possibility of a Wuhan lab leak thoroughly in the May 14th, 2020 program. That's nearly 3 years ago now.
Welcome to the Nexus.
I was presenting the show from my home at the time because of COVID restrictions, which also prevented us from getting any decent haircuts. Here's our lead report from that program back in May 2020.
Chinese authorities claim the virus surfaced at a wet market in Wuhan. But U.S. intelligence is investigating other theories, including whether the virus was accidentally released by a lab a few miles away that had been researching pathogens carried by bats.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
This Institute of Virology is the only facility in China that has a level 4 biosecurity regime because it handles the most dangerous viruses in the world, including a range of bat coronaviruses.
Mr. Secretary, have you seen anything that gives you high confidence that it originated in that Wuhan lab?
Martha, there's enormous evidence that that's where this began.
溯源的问题，所以我想彭佩奥先生反复的讲，但他就拿不出证据来。
We have not received any data or specific evidence from the US government relating to the purported origin of the virus.
Do any of the investigations show that the virus originated in Wuhan or from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
实际上我们很清楚。As we said early on, there's no way this virus came from us.
China is not the kind of country that would welcome a confession that one of its own laboratories was to blame for all this death and destruction.
I'll miss her every day. Being here won't be the same without her.
I feel for you.
China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories.
When you put it all together, there is a very plausible hypothesis here that someone became infected in the laboratory, walked out, and started to infect other people in Wuhan.
Well, 1 year after our programme, the satirist Jon Stewart came to the same conclusion on the Stephen Colbert Show. And at the time, it was seen as a pretty outrageous thing to say.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean like perhaps there's a chance that this was created in a lab, there's an investigation?
A chance?
Well, but
oh my
if
God.
there was evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think? And then they ask those scientists, they're like, how did this... So wait a minute, you work at the Wuhan Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. How did this happen? And they're like, a pangolin kissed a turtle.
OK, let's bring in our new panel now. And we have Tim Trevan, a biosecurity expert who's also a former UN weapons inspector. And we have Eric Fagel-Ding, the chief of the COVID task force at the World Health Network. Thank you to both of you for joining us on The Nexus today. So the US Energy Department concluded that the COVID pandemic most likely arose from a laboratory leak. Tim Trevan, what are we to make of that?
Well, the fact of the matter is we're never really going to know where it came from definitively because we have not had full cooperation from the Chinese authorities. And there are multiple plausible explanations as to how this could have arisen. But on the balance of probabilities with low confidence, it seems that those who have the most information outside of China are coming to a conclusion that the lab leak is the leading candidate. But I don't think we're ever going to get much further than that.
What is the significance of it being a lab leak, if indeed it is, as opposed to, say, coming from a wet market or occurring in nature from, bats meeting with humans in rural China, for example? What is the significance of it coming from the lab?
Well, here I'm a little out of line with the bulk of the biosafety and biosecurity community and the policymakers. Personally, I don't think it makes a huge difference if it came from the lab or not in terms of how we deal with things in the future. I think what's more important in terms of learning lessons for the future is for people who have expertise in the field to imagine all the different ways in which this virus could have arisen and to plan to mitigate against each of those different potential routes for its evolution and its exposure to the human population. So to me, that's always been the way forward, is to imagine all the possible ways it could have happened. Now, if it were a lab leak, yes, we can focus our efforts on understanding precisely how this happened. The most likely thing is carelessness or lack of training. And particularly, to me, the most likely thing is that they were collecting unknown viruses and treating them as animal viruses rather than applying a universal precautionary principle of handling everything unknown as being potentially infectious for humans.
I think there's an emotional moral issue here, which is probably not very important to scientists perhaps, which is that a lot of people died, a lot of people's lives were destroyed and ruined, and if it was carelessness, people would like to know. If it was carelessness and could have been avoided, people want to know. Is there any chance that we are ever going to know from the Chinese government what really happened?
In my opinion, it's highly unlikely, unless there's a change of leadership, either at the lab or unless there's someone with a conscience at the lab who had data which would have proven that particular hypothesis, who comes forward and speaks up. Absent that, I don't think we're ever going to be able to definitively say this was the way COVID arose and this is how it got into the human population.
Right. Dr. Eric Fagelding, does it make a difference from an epidemiologist's point of view where it came from?
Thanks for having me. I think it doesn't really matter at the current time. It may matter in the future because, obviously we want to prevent a repeat of it. In many ways, this lab leak has been conflated with two different issues. Some people think it's a bioengineered virus. That's what the conspiracy theories are trying to suggest. Well, a lab leak of a natural virus that they collected from a cave and brought to the lab and accident leak, that kind of thing actually happens quite often, more than we think. The other thing is I want to highlight that the Energy Department made this conclusion with low confidence. I think people always forget that small footnote. And of 8 U.S. intelligence agencies, 2 said yes, maybe. 2 said no, it's not a lab leak, and 4 others have abstained and have put out no opinion on this so far. So, it's only 2 out of 8 U.S. agencies, and many other international organizations have not accepted that it's a lab leak. So I think still the jury is definitely still out. We do not even have a majority or quorum in terms of agreement on this. So I think it's this pushing the lab leak narrative. It's inappropriate at this current time because we really simply don't know. And as the other gentleman said, I don't know if we will ever truly know. But obviously we should take lessons, and maybe if we were precautionary, to prevent it for next time. But at the current time, the cat's out of the bag, and the issue is it's a global pandemic. But can we make sure it never happens again? That is what I'm always trying to focus on.
The other agency, obviously, is the FBI, which has its own microbiologists, immunologists, and other scientists, and so on. And the Energy Department, although it sounds completely irrelevant, is said to have this new intelligence, which is bringing it to this conclusion. And it is actually not just an Energy Department, but has considerable scientific expertise. Why would the Energy Department have that kind of expertise?
So the Energy Department runs several major national laboratories, and these laboratories include not just physics, engineering laboratories, but also many biomedical potential laboratories. For example, the drug Paxlovid was partly developed by the Energy Department laboratories. Many people don't know that. This is well documented. The Paxlovid, the COVID drug, came from one of the Energy Department laboratories, partly their R&D. So yes, they do have some expertise, but whether they have more additional information that newly discovered, which they have not really disclosed, that other agencies didn't have, I'm not really sure about that. And this is why it's still a low confidence conclusion. Well, the FBI is still, it's a mostly domestic, obviously enforcement agency. It's not its labs are not the same, does not do the same thing. They're doing some of these research. And the ones that do it, certain military virology institutes, they have not put out any conclusions whatsoever.
Tim?
So the only additional point I'd make about the role of Department of Energy is, of course, there are human factors that go into safety and security at laboratories, which are independent of what is in the laboratory. And the Department of Energy, of course, has been a major player in the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. So they have developed many human practices related to security of either highly dangerous or high value items to ensure that they're not stolen or misused. And many of those lessons are transferable to biological labs and the protection of society against biological agents. And so that's probably part of the evolution of how they've got into biological lab safety is that cross-disciplinary application of lessons learned in the nuclear field into the biological field.
Tim Trevan and Eric Fagel-Ding, thank you so much for your help here on The Nexus today, and thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube, just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.